Hello, welcome again. This is our introductory video for Chapter 22, Fighting for the Four Freedoms of the Foner textbook. It's also a particular point or lecture that I have in my classes called World War II, the Good War. So it's kind of interesting, right, to think of war as a good thing. But for Americans during the 1940s and definitely after the war, they would kind of look back on this as the right war at the right time against the right enemies. And one of the reasons why is because of their president, Franklin Roosevelt, kind of putting this war in very stark moral terms. He's going to come out early, actually before the war even begins, and really define what this war is about for a lot of Americans. So stop and think about that for a second. Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States in 1932, has a lot on his plate. He has a national economy that's disintegrating before his very eyes, a catastrophe economically that the United States had never experienced before. He has then a few years later the Dust Bowl to contend with, and at the same time, internationally, he has other crises coming onto the scene, causing problems. So think about this. This president has the most problems probably since any president since Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. Right? He's really beset by problems both domestically and internationally. So here's yet another challenge, yet another problem for Franklin Roosevelt to deal with during his presidency. And this problem was showing up pretty early on in his administration. No sooner did he take over in 1933 than there were already kind of these rumors of war out there. And as the international scene worsened, Americans really didn't want to get dragged into that. They had enough problems at home. They wanted those problems overseas to stay there, to keep America out of those issues. Because a lot of Americans felt that World War I had been a mistake, that they'd really gotten involved in a war that was none of their business, that they got nothing out of, and that their intervention didn't seem to make the world a better place. So for a lot of Americans, during the Great Depression, they were very isolationist, is a word that's used by historians to explain what they were doing. They just did not want to get involved in these international disputes, and there were quite a few of them. Throughout the 1930s, countries like Japan become more and more aggressive. As Europe and the United States are kind of mired in the Great Depression, especially the United States, Europe's going to recover relatively quickly. But the United States stays mired in this economic malaise for the whole decade, really. But other countries bounced back much quicker, Japan being one of them, and it used its economic and industrial muscle to start trying to expand its influence, especially against its neighbor China. In the early 1930s, Japan started taking over large chunks of territory from China. Even though it was condemned internationally through the League of Nations and just independent nations coming out and saying what they were doing was a horrible thing, Japan didn't care. It ignored it. Left the League of Nations, and no repercussions happened. So once again, kind of reinforced for a lot of Americans that international causes just weren't worth it, worth the effort, weren't worth the trouble. And this continued all through the 1930s. Italy would attack an African nation called Ethiopia in 1935. The U.S., due to public pressure, Franklin Roosevelt would come out and say the U.S. was going to not get involved in this conflict. It passes the Neutrality Act. We wouldn't sell weapons to either side. Well, of course, Italy didn't need our weapons. They were a modern European economy and were able to produce a lot of their own weapons for their war. Who needed our weapons, who needed support, were the Ethiopians, who wouldn't be able to get any funding or money or arms from the United States. Ended up allowing Italy to slowly but surely take over that country. But Franklin Roosevelt wasn't idle during this period. He didn't ignore what was happening in the world. One of the things he did to try and help the United States internationally was trying to shore up our alliances or friendships with countries here in our own hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere. He started a thing called the Good Neighbor Policy in the 1930s as a way to make Latin American countries more agreeable to the U.S., to see us less as the enemy or as a dangerous neighbor and more as an ally, a friend, somebody they could count on. So gone were the days of American interventionism in places like Nicaragua and Cuba. Franklin Roosevelt now pledges the United States to working with the governments of Latin America to try and solve problems collectively in the Western Hemisphere. So the United States was moving in a direction to try and shore up our relationships around the world, to try and make sure that we weren't truly isolated from the world and kind of left at the mercy of these aggressive nations that were showing up. And this is especially important, of course, The most aggressive nation out there during this time was the nation of Germany. Under their new chancellor, the leader of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler, who came to power in 1933, Germany was slowly but surely reinventing itself, becoming much more aggressive. Hitler had come to power on a policy of regaining all of the territory lost to Germany because of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. He was going to put together or reinvigorate the German economy. He was also going to make sure that Germany paid back its enemies, its traitors, the people that let it down during the First World War, those foreign influences, as he called them, often in the persona of Jews within Germany. So he came to power with this program, and he quickly started enabling it. He started carrying out his policies, slowly but surely putting pressure on neighbors to give up territory that had once been part of the German Empire. Begins remilitarizing Germany, things that were forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. He undoes almost all of that. All the while, the great nations of the world, like the United States, Britain, and France, sit by, condemning his actions, but never actually threatening him with any kind of force. It becomes known as a policy of appeasement all throughout the 1930s. And because of Hitler's act, other countries become even more emboldened. Germany doesn't stop. Slowly through the 1930s, keeps adding more territory, parts of Czechoslovakia. Eventually, Austria is added to this new Germany that's built under the Nazi regime, under Hitler's authority. So Germany is becoming a much bigger threat, being very aggressive on the world stage, making secret alliances with countries like Soviet Russia and Japan under their leader Hideki Tojo. At the same time that Hitler's active in Europe, countries like Russia are attacking their neighbor, Finland, putting pressure on countries like Poland and other Baltic states. At the same time, Japan out in the Pacific is also being aggressive, taking over even larger chunks of coastal China, sometimes committing just horrible atrocities like in the city of Nanking, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers and Chinese civilians are slaughtered by the Japanese army in 1938. So the world's becoming an increasingly dangerous place. And Franklin Roosevelt starts telling Americans that they've got to start paying attention, especially after Germany creates or really ignites a true world war. Now, there had been a lot of shooting already, but when Germany invades Poland in 1939, Britain and France feel they have to act now, that they have to stop this aggression. So they go to war. The United States continues its isolationism, continues to not want to get involved in what a lot of Americans still see as a European war. But Franklin Roosevelt sees that this war is going to involve us one way or another. And in early 1941, after France has been knocked out of the war by Germany, when it seems that only Great Britain is going to be able to stand up against Germany, he starts telling the American people what's at stake here. And now think about this. This is also after his third election, because in 1940, Roosevelt's going to run for president for a third time. It's unprecedented. No American president had ever done that before, to be elected 3 times. But he told the American people, things are dangerous out here. We're still not out of the Great Depression, and the world situation is worsening. We need to keep going with the policies that we have in hand. And the American people agreed and reelected him, which also scared his political opponents, the Republicans, who were going to push through an amendment to make sure that these kind of things don't happen again, but that won't be until after Roosevelt's done with his 4th term, actually. But you can see that as things get scary out there in the world, as more and more Americans are worried about what's happening globally, internationally, Roosevelt's trying to tell Americans that what's happening out there in the world can't be ignored, that we have to start paying attention. In January of 1941, after being reelected president, he's going to come out with this very famous speech, the 4 Freedoms speech, where he tells Americans, look, we have a stake here, that this is important to us, that Great Britain has to be saved, because if Great Britain goes down, if they get conquered by the Nazis, we will truly be alone. There'll be no more great democracies out there. He calls on the American people to be that arsenal of democracy, to help these countries withstand aggressive neighbors like Japan, Italy, Germany. And then he starts telling the American people, you're going to have to be committed to defending yourself, not just at home, but abroad as well. If you believe in certain things, that they're important, what he called the 4 freedoms, then you have to be willing to fight for them. And you can kind of see in this illustration over here, this Captain America comic book. Now, Captain America had come out in 1940 was its first year. And that's one of the things you'll know if you ever get to take a class from me face to face. I talk a lot about baseball cards, Disney, and comic books. So it's not unusual that this kind of stuff pops up in my lectures. But if you kind of look at this comic book comes out in or in April of 1941, and you can see who's the enemy here already. You know, we're not at war with these guys, but here is Hitler seen as the enemy, and that what's his target? The United States of America. So already people are starting to understand that this war is going to be about them. And Franklin Roosevelt tries to tell Americans what is at stake, why they need to be involved. And he summed it up in 4 very simple ways, what he called the 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Now, if you stop and think about that, those are really kind of core portions of something that should be very familiar to most Americans. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, those are our First Amendment rights. Freedom from want, you could kind of see as economic freedom, right? The ability to be able to have whatever job you want, kind of those ideas that America is really founded on, the opportunity. Freedom from fear, that you shouldn't fear your government or others from coming in and taking these things away, that you are guaranteed certain liberties, right? So again, very American ideals, but he's saying that these aren't just American ideals, that these are now ideals that should be shared by everybody across the world. And that if you can take those freedoms, those liberties away from somebody outside the United States, what it meant, what FDR was trying to apply to Americans was, then they could be taken away from you as well. And that you have to defend somebody else's freedom to be truly free yourself. Well, Americans begin responding to this. There's a big buildup towards war. But a lot of Americans remain reluctant. They're still not interested in getting involved in what they saw as an international conflict. But of course, that all changes later in 1941 when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, destroy a large portion of the American Pacific Fleet. And now the United States finds itself truly in a world war. It has multiple enemies in multiple fronts. One of the interesting things about World War II is the United States becomes one of the few countries that's ever going to be able to successfully wage a 2-front war, fighting all the way across the globe in both directions, and win. So that's kind of an amazing thing. So to be able to pull off something so big, so monumental, really, right? Fighting enemies so far away and on so many fronts, it's going to require efforts. It means that in a lot of ways, America really has to pull together. And another thing to kind of keep in mind here is, this is actually like the second major event that a lot of Americans are going to be able to share, especially younger Americans, those who were born in the 1920s, that have grown up through the Great Depression. Now they're going to go through yet another major event, World War II together, this time as young men, women, fighting this war, helping the United States get through this war. It's going to take all of them working together to get these things done. So they've experienced the Great Depression, where everybody, whether you were rich or poor, felt the sting of the Great Depression. Well, now everybody, whether you're rich or poor, are going to feel the effects of this war as well. So these are amazing bonding moments for the United States. Really brings this whole generation of Americans together. Really makes them feel like they're one group, if you will. There are, of course, going to be some limits to this, but we'll kind of see that a lot of Americans feel that they've really pitched in. They're going to do their part for this war effort. So you can kind of see it's going to require a lot of people. More than 15 million American men are going to serve in the military by the end of the war. Hundreds of thousands of women as well. Hundreds of thousands of those 15 million men are going to be African Americans. But there's also going to be a lot of other groups. Armenians, Mexicans, Native Americans are all going to serve together as well. And while there's still going to be some issues, this is still going to be a segregated military. There's going to be white units and black units. What's kind of interesting here is, in those white units will be Hispanics, Italian Americans, Native Americans, German Americans, all these different groups that have been immigrating in the United States for the past 30, 40 years, 50 years in some cases, are all going to get thrown together. They're really going to get to know each other. A lot of those differences that seemed important 30 or 40 years ago during the Gilded Age, no longer going to be that big of a deal. And a lot of people are going to be affected by this war in a very direct way. Hundreds of thousands of Americans are going to be killed, even more wounded. About 1% 1% of the American population is killed or wounded in this war. 1 out of 100 people. That is a tremendous number. It's actually the biggest number the United States has ever had to deal with as a population, other than the Civil War when Americans were killing Americans. So this is a big change, or this is a big effect on the United States. Now it still kind of pales in comparison to what's happening to some countries like the Soviet Union, Russia, that's going to lose more than 20 million people in this war. About 1 out of 10 Russians is going to die in this war, either from starvation, indirectly from the effects of war, or directly from bullets and bombs. So this war is a massive conflict, is what I'm trying to say. And the United States, to be effective, to carry out its mission, to make sure it wins this war, really has to commit itself completely, right, on all fronts here, home front as well as on the battlefront. So to do this, we really have to harness our industrial might. And you can see that it happens, right? The effects of the Great Depression are finally shaken off by the United States economy. They have to. They just have to produce the needed war materials. They have to produce the things that they need to fight this war, especially since it's so huge, so far away, requires so much material and people, right? You have to outfit 15 million men. You have to get them supplies. You have to get them the weapons they need, the ammunition they need, everything they need. So what kind of happens is between 1942 and 45, those 4 or 5 years of the war for the United States, we're going to build more factories than we had in the previous 15 before that. So the entire Great Depression, the United States did very little economically as far as the industrial backbone of the country. But within 5 years of World War II, suddenly the American economy is booming again. American industry is producing all out, all the time. We become the largest manufacturer again in the world. Once again, the United States outproduces all of our enemies combined. If you take everything that Italy, Germany, and Japan produced during the war, the United States produced more than all three of them put together. Because we have to. We have to outfit our troops, but we also have to help our allies, the British, the remnants of the French military, the Soviets, the Russians need help. So we're going to send them supplies as well. So the United States is going to commit wholeheartedly to this war. It has to. And it's going to transform the American economy. By 1945, the American government is spending as much on the war effort as the entire American economy had been back in the 1930s during the Great Depression. So that just tells you how much has changed, how much the economy is growing because of all this spending, all this building, putting everybody to work. There is no more unemployment. The United States actually doesn't have enough workers. We have to find workers from anywhere and everywhere we possibly can, putting people in factories that we never would have thought we would put in factories before. And it's going to transform not just economically the nation, but just the way the nation exists. Places like California are going to see a lot of this federal money. It's going to make California an industrial powerhouse where it really hadn't been before. It's also going to push California agriculture to grow. It's going to mean that the United States is going to start looking at all regions to kind of produce. The South becomes industrialized during this period. So a lot's changing here because of this war. And we do make a lot of stuff during the war. We're going to make tens of thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of planes, more than 1,000 ships, naval combat ships. Also, we're going to make merchant ships to carry all the supplies that we need. It's just staggering, really, when you stop back and look at how much the United States produced during the war. Another would be that the United States would build these little merchant ships called Liberty ships to carry our supplies around the world because they were getting sunk quickly. We needed to build them quickly. Well, American manufacturers figured out how to build one of these ships every day of every year for the entire war. One of these Liberty ships was rolling off of a dock or sailing out of port every day somewhere in the United States. So that's really kind of staggering if you stop and think about just how much industrial output the United States does during World War II. To make that possible, as men are going off to war to fight in combat, it means you need to find people to actually fill those jobs that are being left vacant by these soldiers. And one of the most obvious places to go and find workers to pull off this industrial manufacturing is, of course, women. They'd done it in the First World War. Well, now they're asked to do it again. But this time it's going to last longer. World War I we were involved in for about 18 months. Now we're going to be involved in this war for really about 5 years. So a lot of women are going to go to work. They understand that they're going to work just for the war, right? For the period of the war, for the duration. That this isn't a permanent change. But at the same time, so while traditional values haven't changed, at the same time, they are showing that they can do things that wasn't really considered feminine before, that they could do things very masculine in nature, right? Building ships, building planes, tanks, working heavy equipment. They have to, so they do. So it breaks down a lot of stereotypes. Proves that women can really do a lot of complex jobs, physically demanding work. They just don't have to be teachers, domestic workers, clerical staff, that they can do a lot of things. Now those traditional roles are still going to be kind of considered what they're supposed to do first. But because of these work like Rosie the Riveter, like in the posters here on this screen, you kind of see that these old stereotypes are breaking down. And it's not just women that are going to go into the workforce in a big way. African Americans, once again, are going to be asked to show up. Hundreds of thousands of them are going to move, especially when Roosevelt puts out Executive Order 8802 and says that the federal government will not allow racial discrimination in any of its plants or any of the places that are building war materials for the federal government, that those manufacturers have to be open to anybody of any race or color. So out in California, places like the Oakland Naval Yard or the Long Beach Naval Yard, a lot of African Americans are going to find jobs, as well as Hispanic Americans. Same thing in the South. A lot of the Birmingham or Mobile, Alabama shipyards are going to hire African Americans. So there's a lot of change, right? At the same time, there are some other issues, because we're up against some what we consider to be very ugly enemies. We kind of see them as ugly people. They're caricatures of Germans, of Japanese during this time, where we kind of vilify these enemies. And that's going to have an impact domestically as well. Because while African Americans are going to be asked to come into the war plants and help build the material of war, help serve in our military, at the same time, a lot of African Americans that fill those jobs, that fill those voids, are still going to be subjected to racial discrimination, segregation. There are going to be race riots in different places in the United States, places like out in Los Angeles, places like Detroit, where a lot of African Americans leave the South to go to find jobs. So there is an ugly side to this war as well. As much as we're all coming together to kind of work together to fight this war and make it successful, there are still a lot of issues. One of the best examples of this is what happens in Los Angeles in 1943, when the Los Angeles police force goes and rounds up Marines and soldiers and naval personnel that are on leave in Los Angeles, getting ready to ship out to wherever they're going, and ask them to go into some of the Mexican neighborhoods, the barrios of Los Angeles, and go around and beat up some of the young kids that are there. They have race riots for several days in June of 1943. Really scares a lot of people. The Los Angeles police just see these Hispanic youths as being kind of dangerous, as challenging their authority. So they want to teach them a lesson, and they ask these soldiers and sailors to do it, and they do, right? It's more than 600 Mexican Americans are going to be put in jail. Not one of these soldiers, sailors, not one military person is going to be put in jail for these race riots. So there's still a lot of issues here in the United States. The war is covering up the fact that we haven't dealt with these issues as we probably should have. The First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, is going to come out and say, this isn't about the way these Hispanic kids dress. It isn't about the way they act. These are old worries. These are old problems that we really haven't dealt with. And she's very right. She's very prescient here. She kind of sees what's happening, that we cannot keep kind of treating Americans in two different ways. We can't have two classes of Americans, right? One white that gets all full privileges, and then people of color that aren't allowed full citizenship, that aren't treated with equality. She kind of sees that these things have to change. This is especially true for Japanese Americans. After Japan attacks Hawaii and at Pearl Harbor, the United States government, under Roosevelt's auspices, passes Executive Order 9066. So executive orders come directly from the president. So the same president that said people should have freedom from fear and freedom from want also says that Japanese Americans are dangerous and need to be rounded up. Now, this executive order actually never says Japanese Americans anywhere in it. It just says anybody deemed an enemy to the United States. But it's left to the War Department to carry out this executive order to protect the United States from any foreign or domestic subversives that might challenge the United States, that might cause problems. And General DeWitt, the general that's put in charge of this from the U.S. Army, decides that there's really only one enemy here, and that's Japanese Americans, that they're possibly too tied to their home country, their home culture, and they're seen as a dangerous threat to the United States, and he's going to order them to be rounded up. More than 100,000 Japanese Americans living in primarily the West Coast, but in the United States. 80,000 of them born in the United States and U.S. citizens. Under this executive order, General DeWitt's going to make them sell their homes, most of their property, sometimes at almost no value, without any other way to save it. They can't just come back and get their property later. They're told they have to sell it off now at whatever price is available, and then they're shipped off to camps. And at the same time, a lot of these people that are being rounded up, a lot of these Japanese Americans that are being put into these camps, well, their boys, their men are going to be asked to go and fight for the government that's putting their families in these camps. That's especially true here in the Valley, where a lot of Japanese Americans lived. A number of Japanese Americans in the Valley are going to join the U.S. military, be put into a segregated unit called Regimental Combat Teams. And one of them, the 442nd, which is made up of all Valley boys, really, young men from here in the Central Valley, from Bakersfield to Merced, is going to be sent over to Europe, where they're going to be one of the most decorated combat units in the U.S. Army. They're going to, every one of those soldiers is going to win multiple medals, right, for their valor in combat and for the heroic deeds they do for their country, all the while their families are sitting in concentration camps back in the United States. And they're going to be all over the place. So it is an interesting thing, right, that the United States, Roosevelt commits the United States to defending these freedoms across the world, but at the same time, we're not talking about them here at home, right? We're still saying that there's still two Americas, really, one for white Americans and one for other Americans. So you can kind of see in some foreshadowing here that when you fight this momentous a conflict, when there this many people have to be participants, we need everybody pitching in, doing their part, that it becomes a little harder to say, we want you to help out, but you're still not equal to us. You're still not one of us. So you can see that there's some handwriting on the wall here. Things are going to have to change down the road. But because of the United States' commitment to this war, because of the heroic work of our allies, the British and the Russians and the French and South Americans, there's all kinds of countries. More than 100 countries are going to fight with the United States against what are called the Axis powers. Slowly but surely, the war turns in our favor. By 1944, it becomes pretty obvious we're going to win. By 1945, we understand it's just a matter of time. Now, what's unfortunate is the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, after winning his fourth term, something that will never be duplicated by another president, he dies in April of 1945, just a few months after being reelected for his fourth term. But he knows that the United States is going to win this war. It's a foregone conclusion. As a matter of fact, within a few weeks, Nazi Germany surrenders, and within a few months, Japan surrenders as well. So the world does kind of end. Now, part of it is because of the use of atomic weapons on Japan. Once those weapons are dropped, the Japanese know there's absolutely no hope of being able to negotiate their way out of this war, that they're going to have to surrender to the United States. And that leaves the world in kind of an interesting position. Things have certainly changed. Countries like the United States and Russia are seen as the world's dominant military powers. Old powers like Britain and France are really kind of bankrupt, broken economies, broken countries that are going to take decades, if not many decades, to repair themselves. But some of the old geopolitical realities remain. Churchill and Stalin, Winston Churchill, the leader of Great Britain, Joseph Stalin, the leader of Soviet Russia, really kind of want to do things in a traditional way. They want a balance of power in Europe and really in the world. Stalin wants to really have a say in what happens in the Near East, places like northern China, places like the Middle East, Eastern Europe especially. He wants that to be kind of a Soviet sphere of influence, where he really has a say as to what happens. Churchill wants to protect the British Empire. Now, what's interesting here is Franklin Roosevelt is more like a Wilsonian Democrat. He wants collective security. He thinks that it's the failure of things like the League of Nations that got the world into such a predicament, that he wants something more robust than the League of Nations. He wants a real commitment to international security through a variety of mechanisms. So he's kind of fighting this war again like a progressive, much like Wilson did in the First World War. And even after his death, the United States is going to kind of push for this international system to make sure this kind of a conflict never happens again. After all, this is a big deal. In the First World War, more than 20 million people are going to die across the world. Well, in this war, it's more than 100 million. So the numbers are getting bigger, and with the use of atomic weapons, the devastation could get even worse if there were a third world war. So there's a lot of things going to be put into play here to try and make sure that we don't have a third world war. And it's also because of things like just the atrocities committed by our enemies, especially things like the Holocaust against the Jews or the Japanese war crimes, just the way that prisoners were treated by the Japanese. Going to make Americans see those countries as really being the bad guys, that we were the good guys, stepping in to stop people like that, countries like that, from doing these horrible things. But because of what it seemed anybody could really do now, just the amount of power that was out there, the way this industrial world worked now, that you could basically industrialize death, mass manufacture death, the Americans saw that they needed to really kind of get a grip on this, that we just couldn't keep having war after war after war. And at the same time in the United States, a lot of different groups in the United States really felt empowered by this war. Women, again, kind of did their part. They showed that they could do basically anything that men could do and do it just as well. So they were kind of empowered by the war, got a very much a sense of confidence, as well as African Americans, Hispanic Americans, all kinds of minority groups felt that like they really stepped in and did their part. And another thing about World War II that really makes it kind of nostalgic for a lot of Americans is the fact that it also ended the Great Depression. While the economy didn't keep booming completely after World War II, within a few years, by 1948, 1949, it was clear that the Great Depression was over and the United States economy was only going to grow from here on out, at least for a significant period of time. So that all these things left a kind of a good feeling in Americans' psyche after the World War II. We were the largest power in the world. We helped win a war against very harsh enemies. And now we kind of felt like we had a duty to make sure that the world was a better place than it had been before. So please, thank you for joining me. Look over all the material for this particular chapter. And please remember that after this module, you'll be taking your midterm exam. So study hard. There'll be plenty of questions on the midterm about World War II. All right, thank you very much.